transition from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. So that's going to be the first part of our next unit is the Renaissance. So we're going to kind of look at how the Middle Ages are going to start to fall away, and we're going to start to see a rebirth in learning. So that's what the staircase is about. So on the last page, we're going to keep revisiting the staircase, and that's basically your processor. We'll keep going through it as we go through the notes. And then also make sure you highlight anything on here that's highlighted in this presentation, okay? All right, so here we go. So we're going to start with the staircase. So we're going to move from the Middle Ages, which in the Middle Ages, there's a devotion to God and the maintenance of a strict social hierarchy. So in that first text box there, click in there and type that in, okay? And then we're going to move to the Renaissance, where we see a rebirth of classical learning and a belief in human potential. So we're moving away from that idea that our entire life is revolving around religion, moving into a place where our lives are more focused on individual people and our own potential and trying to make the world a better place. Okay, so you can see that's what the staircase is about. So we're going to move down into the decline of feudalism, but we're going to move up in the staircase to the development of the Renaissance. Okay, so we're going to start with the Black Death. So I know we've talked about all of these things, but this is kind of to wrap it all in a nice little bow for you. So the Black Death, what was it? So it was a deadly plague that spread across Europe. It was spread by bacteria. Remember, it was on the rats from Kaffa, okay? And there were 3 forms of it. So the most common form was the bubonic. So that's the third one on here. So that's caused by buboes on the body. So those were like big open sores. There was also pneumonic. So it was where it was in the lungs, and septicemic, where it was in your bloodstream. And it spread. So it originated in Mongolia, and it spread to the Black Sea along the Silk Road. So, like I said, it was carried by fleas on the black rats, and then those Italian merchant ships went to Kaffa on the Black Sea, and those rats got on those ships, and then they brought those ships to Europe, and then those rats got off those ships and started spreading it around. So we first actually see it in Sicily, which is just south. It's right on the toe of the boot of Italy. So why couldn't people stop it? They were ignorant about its cause, so they blamed the stars, they blamed God's anger, they blamed the Jews, all things we talked about in the last set of notes. And so they tried ineffective cures like pomanders, flagellation, and repentance of sins. So pomanders are those like those balls of smoke. And so a priest would come into your house with like incense in it, and they would like fan that over the sick. Flagellation is where they would whip themselves. Okay, so there was a group that would they would travel all around Europe, and they would whip themselves and punish themselves because they wanted to make God happy. And then repentance of sins obviously did not work as well. So obviously they would confess their sins and hope that would make them better. So how did it change life? So it killed about 1/3 of the population, so somewhere between 1/3 to 2/3-ish. It did force farmers to diversify their crops. So some farmers would grow like one thing, and then they would trade with other farmers. But what ended up happening is trade declined, so they stopped doing that. So they started to grow different types of things. Peasants are going to revolt and demand more freedom, so we see the end of serfdom, and the working class moved to cities for better wages. So remember we talked about the rise of cities, so there's more opportunity there for work, and then it reduced the power of feudal lords, and many of those feudal lords had to free their serfs. Okay, so getting back to the staircase, so we're going to decline feudalism, so we're going to keep going back to this after each slide here. So the Black Death killed about 1/3 of the population, and peasants revolted and demanded more freedom. Oh, sorry. Oops. Go back. Sorry. That's my bad. Okay. So that's that. Okay. Moving on to the 100 Years' War. So how did the war begin? So the French King Charles IV died in 1328 with no male heir. So 2 men attempted to claim the throne. One was Edward III of England, who was his son-in-law, and the other was Philip of Valois, who was his nephew. Philip, FYI, wins. But the English armies are going to attack France, so they're going to attack against Philip. So the nature of warfare is really going to change in that longbows will eliminate the advantages of armor. So the arrows could pierce the armor that was being used. Eventually, gunpowder will be introduced, so cannons could be used to blast holes in castles. So castles, fortifying yourself in a castle is not nearly as effective as it was before. And monarchs used their own armies that were recruited from common people, so they didn't have to rely on the nobles to provide soldiers anymore. Joan of Arc. So we watched the little video the other day and talked about her, but she was a young French peasant woman who was inspired by God to save France. She convinced Charles VII, who was the King of France, to let her lead an army in 1429 at the Battle of Orleans, and she won. And she helped push the English armies out of central France. But eventually she was captured and she was tried by the Inquisition, accused of heresy, and she was burned at the stake in 1431. She will be venerated as a saint in 1922, but as was discussed in the video we watched, there was no relics of her because they burnt her twice, so she is literally all ashes, so there weren't any bones or anything left. So there are no relics of her. And then the last thing, so how did it contribute to the end of feudalism in France? So people started to become more patriotic because they started to get a more sense of nationalism. So that's kind of an idea of what does it mean to be French? Okay, what does it mean to be English, and how are those two different? And so it's kind of like school spirit, like we're the K-Hawks and we do things a certain way, and we don't like the Tigers over in Edwardsville because they do things their way. So it's kind of similar to that. But monarchs also started to build huge armies with the taxes they collected, and that reduced the power of the nobility. All right, getting back to the staircase. So the 100 Years' War allowed monarchs to build huge armies and reduce the power of lords. I think that's the only one of this. It is. Okay. So there's that. Okay. So trade and commerce. So foundations of town life. So towns were the center for trade and shipping. So there were luxury goods that were being sold, like silk, spices, ivory, things like that. Those could be bought in towns. And guilds dominated social and civic life of towns. And the guilds really reflected the importance of Christianity because they would often contribute to building cathedrals. So like we looked at Notre Dame, for example, and they would often adopt patron saints and sponsor parades in their honor. And so there would be like patron saints of entire towns in some cases, which was kind of a cool thing. So town life in the Middle Ages versus eventually during the Renaissance. So towns were small because society was based on agriculture, and most people lived in the countryside, where during the Renaissance we're going to move to a place where towns are much bigger because society is more based on commerce, and so more people as a result live in cities. As far as power goes, the nobility really had the most of the power in the Middle Ages, so the lords owned the land, and the towns needed protection from the knights that they controlled, where during the Renaissance, the middle class really gets more of the power in the towns themselves. So they limited the power of the feudal lords by forcing them to grant charters. So they had to have their own charter where they could control the city, and then they gained control of great sums of money by organizing their own banks. And then as far as status goes, in the Middle Ages, your status was determined by your birthright. So if you're born a serf, you die a serf. If you're born a lord, you die a lord. Okay, there was no mobility, no social mobility. But in the Renaissance, we start to see a little more of that social mobility because status will now be determined more by wealth and ability than it will be by birthright, which is something we have more of today. Okay, so getting back to the staircase. So we're going to end the Middle Ages here. So people moved to cities to earn better wages, and status began to be determined by wealth and ability, not by birthright. All right. So growth of Italian city-states. So what was the Renaissance? Why did it begin in Italy? So Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. And so this is when scholars started to become more interested in ancient Greek and Roman culture. And a big reason why they became more interested in that is because, as we talked about when we talked about Islam, the Muslims preserved a lot of the old Greek and Roman works, and so those were kind of discovered during the Crusades. And also the Italian city-states funded, like especially Venice, funded a lot of those crusades, and so they became immensely wealthy because of increased trade. And so they started to display their wealth by giving financial support to artists who created works with classical themes. So how did Florence become the most influential city-state? So this is going to be the big one. This is where Da Vinci is from. So when we talk about the Renaissance, we'll talk a lot about him. But they maintained thriving industry in wool and silk. They purchased luxury items from the East and sold them for a large profit. They also sold insurance to sea traders in order to protect their overseas investments. They created banks. So we talked about the money economy that developed. So they created banks and they started to make more money on interest rates and that, and exchanging currency. And the Medici family, you're going to need to know about these guys. They're going to be pretty influential in the Renaissance. The Medici family promoted trade, banking, the arts, scholarship, and civic pride. And they are the ruling family of Florence. So why were they so rich and powerful? So they had strong ties with the Byzantine and Muslim merchants, and that was one of the effects of the Crusades. But each city-state specialized in one commercial activity. So, for example, Milan, they were really militaristic, so they sold a lot of metal goods and armor. Florence was more focused on baking and textiles, and then Venice was really focused on selling Asian goods. And so the European monarchs and nobles even sought loans from these merchants. So it's kind of weird that kings were looking towards these common people and asking them for loans. Excuse me. So, moving on to the staircase. So, scholars and artists look to art and writing from ancient Greece and Rome for guidance. And the Medici family of Florence used their profits to promote scholarship and the arts. Oops, keep that there for a second. Okay. So last one here, the spirit of the Renaissance. So, why people like me became interested in ancient culture. So ignore these bubbles and focus on these. So they're going to this guy right here. Okay, so he's a humanist, which we'll talk about what that is in just a second. So knowledge of the ancient Greece and Rome was discovered by scholars, in large part because the Muslims had preserved that. But the Crusades made Europeans eager to learn more about the world around them, because really they realized how advanced the Muslims were and that they needed to catch up. And so scholars thought that ancient Greek and Roman writings could help solve some of those problems. And so the spirit of the Renaissance included a fascination with classical culture. So artists would use the ancient art as models. Donatello created statues that copied the Roman ideal of the human body, for example. Brunelleschi designed buildings after studying ruins in Rome, so he was an architect and he made buildings like that, and revolutionary innovations were made as well. There was also a belief in human potential, so they believed that each person could achieve great things and claimed that people educated in the classics could create a better world, and so there was an emphasis on human achievement in this life on Earth rather than in the afterlife, like during the Middle Ages. So the idea was that you can build yourself up and make yourself a better person in this life, and that will contribute to the world as a whole. And then a new type of scholar called a humanist. So this guy in this picture would be a humanist, and they're more devoted to studying ancient writings and learning more about this world and about humans and what human nature is in this world. So they try to learn about many subjects like Latin, Greek, history, mathematics. One of the more famous humanists is Petrarch. He was a Florentine, so he was from Florence, and he was the first real great humanist. So we'll talk more about him as we get into the next unit of the Renaissance, but this is kind of a bridge between that Middle Ages to moving on to the Renaissance. Okay, so let's finish up the staircase here and get to the Renaissance. So the Crusades made Europeans eager to learn about the world, and the Italian cities with ties to Byzantine and Muslim merchants became rich and powerful, and the middle-class merchants gained control of great sums of money by organizing banks. Okay, and there is everything what yours should look like, but I think yours is red. Um, and that's it. That's all I got for you today. The staircase is your processor. So I hope you guys all enjoy the rest of your day.